Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you here today for what I'm sure is going to be a very special program. My name is Mark Nordenberg. I'm a former chancellor of the university and a former dean of this law school, and currently have the privilege of serving both as chair of the Institute of Politics and as director of its Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy. I do want to welcome all of you on behalf of both of those groups, and speaking more personally, also want to extend a welcome on behalf of Samantha Balbier, who is the director of the Institute of Politics, and Ginny Thornburg, who is the former First Lady of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and a very important part of our forum team. Dick Thornburgh graduated from this law school, and he went on to have an extraordinary career, including service as United States Attorney, Assistant U.S. Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division, two-term governor of Pennsylvania, United States Attorney General under two different presidents, and Undersecretary General of the United Nations. Perhaps more than anything, in all of those positions, Dick was known for his commitment to clean, fair, effective government, to the rule of law, and to the principles of democracy, which makes it particularly appropriate to host a program like this through a forum that bears his name. I also want to gratefully acknowledge the co-sponsors of this program, the School of Law in which we sit, Pitt Cyber, whose leaders are up here in the front, the Department of English, the Pitt News, and the David Frederick Honors College. This week already has brought us another important event that is directly tied to American democracy. I'm referring to the presidential debate that was held in the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia 2 days ago, and I should say was covered by the Pitt News. It served as a reminder that the presidential election is now less than 8 weeks away, that the race appears to be very close, and that Pennsylvania is viewed as the biggest prize among the swing states. The most important right and responsibility of American citizens is voting in such elections. And I want to say that if you haven't registered, or if you now are in a position that you want to change your registration because of a change of residency and an ability to register in Pittsburgh or in Pennsylvania, there will be people from Pitt Votes outside of the courtroom at the end of this program who can assist you in that process. I very rarely quote the wisdom that is found on the walls of bus shelters or T-shirts, but there is a bus shelter that I pass at least twice a day walking into the office and walking back home. And it says, "Your vote is your voice, use it." And as I was walking out of the Cathedral of Learning earlier today, there was a woman who passed me with a sweatshirt that said, "Vote, vote, vote." I do repeat, well, I don't think she meant you should vote 3 times. I think she was just underscoring the importance, and so I do repeat those words to you today. And if there are people in this audience who have not registered to vote or who want to change their registration to Pennsylvania, again, will be in a position to provide some help through pit votes at the end of today's program. 4 short years ago, in a primer written for the 3rd National Symposium on Court Management, the author, a lifelong researcher for the National Center on State Courts, said this: "Trust in public and private institutions has been declining since the mid-1960s in the United States. Few institutions are immune, but the United States Supreme Court is an exception to this downward spiral in trust. Public confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court has been high and stable compared to the national executive and legislative branches. It has been seemingly impervious to the periodic controversies that have surrounded the court and some of its decisions." That was August of 2020. Now, fast forward to March of 2024, less than 4 years later. This is what a team of distinguished authors said in an article published in Science Advances, a publication of the prestigious American Association for the Advancement of Science. The article's opening paragraph is not unlike what I just read you. The authors say, "Even as trust in other U.S. institutions declined sharply in recent decades, the Supreme Court remained an outlier. The public had perceived the court as a legal institution more than a political one, bolstered by its norms, processes, symbols, and independence, and therefore granted greater trust and legitimacy than the other branches. Democrats and Republicans alike shared this assessment, which had long made the court a bulwark against polarization and balkanization that dominates so much of contemporary American political life." That's the first paragraph. Here is the second, but no more. Since 2020, the court's special status has evaporated, with trust in it plummeting by 20 percentage points. The year 2022 saw the lowest levels ever recorded by Gallup in the 50-year history of this question, and 2023 saw almost no change in the public's assessment of the court. Then just last month, the Pew Research Center published a report that included the following observations. Fewer than half of Americans, 47%, now express a favorable opinion of the court, according to a survey conducted by Pew from July 1st to July 7th of 2024, just a few weeks ago. The court's favorable rating is 23 percentage points lower than it was in August of 2020. Just 24% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents view the Supreme Court favorably. That is unchanged since last year and ties the court's lowest favorable rating from either party in more than 30 years. As recently as 2021, before the court's 2022 decision to overturn the federal right to abortion, as well as other controversial rulings, nearly 2/3 of Democrats had a favorable impression of the Supreme Court. By contrast, Republicans are much more likely to continue to view the court favorably, with 73% holding a positive opinion. And note, that is a 49% or a 49-point difference between Democrats at 23% or 24% and Republicans at 73%. Today we have the privilege to learn from two individuals who have developed distinctive forms of expertise with respect to the Supreme Court and the American legal system more generally. More than that, they each hold positions that give them a great deal of power in terms of shaping the opinions of other Americans with respect to the Supreme Court and the legal system. Interestingly, neither of these legal system experts is a lawyer.
I'm glad you've disclosed this.
But each have benefited from a high-quality University of Pittsburgh undergraduate education. They are Brett Murphy, who graduated from Pitt with highest honors in 2013, and who wrote for the Pitt News. He now is a reporter on the national desk of ProPublica, notably after already having received many, many awards for his work. Brett was a part of the team that was awarded the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. The Pulitzer Prize Committee explained that award by saying that his work and the work of others on his team was groundbreaking and ambitious reporting that pierced the thick wall of secrecy surrounding the Supreme Court to reveal how a small group of politically connected billionaires wooed justices with lavish gifts and travel, pushing the court to adopt its first code of conduct. Our second guest is Katelyn Polantz, who graduated from Pitt in 2009 and served as editor-in-chief of the Pitt News, and now is senior crime and justice reporter for CNN. In that role, she has covered many of the most significant legal and quasi-legal proceedings in this country's history. They include both impeachments, the work of the January 6th Special Committee, and the criminal cases brought against former President Trump in New York, Washington, D.C., and Georgia.
In Florida.
And Florida. I left one out, that's right. Her appearances on CNN have been both frequent and impactful. She is an Emmy Award winner for her coverage of the arrest of Roger Stone. Even more important than that, let me note that though I'm not spotting them right now, two of her biggest fans, her mom and dad, are here to participate in this program. I guess that's applause for the entire Polantz family.
Sure.
Rather than further introducing our guests more formally, let me invite you, Brett and Katelyn, to quickly provide a bit of additional information about yourselves, including how you got to Pitt, why you chose journalism, and what path you traveled to the important positions that you currently hold.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Like Mark said, I worked for the Pitt News here. It was actually my first kind of entree into journalism, and I don't know if it was because there was just not very many good scandals or controversies during the Nordenberg administration, but looking back, I didn't write a lot of hard news at the time. I was more interested in film criticism. I had a great professor who was here in the audience with us, Harry Kloman, who really showed me what journalism could be, and I sort of fell in love with it. I came to Pitt for the writing program, and I didn't know where I wanted to go with that. Once I found journalism, and I guess journalism found me a little bit, I wanted to pursue it further. I started writing for some regional publications here. I was lucky enough after graduation to be hired as an associate editor of one of the quarterly magazines here at the university, a position I was wholly unqualified for at the time. And after that, I went to grad school and took the traditional path of a small local newspaper reporter in Florida up to a larger publication at USA Today. And I was on the investigations team there for a few years before moving on to ProPublica. It's a nonprofit, a little bit of a different model, but it's been a real home to me, and I've loved my job ever since I left Pitt, and I have Pitt, I think, to thank for that.
Katelyn?
I too came up through the traditional route of newspaper reporting at a local paper after Pitt, and am also one of the students of Harry Kloman, who was inspired here at Pitt to do traditional reporting, shoe leather, knocking on doors, interviewing people, and learning how to write sharply and develop a news sense. I was at the Roanoke Times initially in Southern Virginia covering everything, including agriculture, which is a great feat because you get to be outside riding around fields. And just by happenstance, when I was sending out many, many resumes, got an interview with the PBS NewsHour in Washington, D.C., which brought me to D.C. That started my developing sources and an understanding of the legal system. And since then, I worked at a legal trade and then joined CNN, essentially to cover the special investigations around Donald Trump in 2017 that has been essentially relentless since then and continue on, and the court cases have caused a lot of coverage, and it has been really a privilege to be able to, as a non-lawyer, translate the American legal system and law to people who are finally interested in not just paying attention to what happens in the White House briefing room or Congress, but who also want to know why things are happening in courts, and especially how the federal courts work, and how law has a role to play in American democracy and politics.
And clearly, the groundbreaking reporting done by Brett was not based upon anything that was publicly revealed in the White House briefing room. And so I think one of the interesting avenues to travel today is how it is you put together an article or a series of articles like that. And Katelyn, you clearly are better qualified to talk to Brett about that than I am, so why don't I turn it over to you?
I'm very excited to ask about all of the journalistic practice here. So Brett essentially is part of the team that was able to uncover and put a spotlight on gifts, trips, and other benefits that have been given to Supreme Court justices who are still on the bench and who sometimes recuse from cases and not always. And I think we should start with, how'd you do it? I mean, this was a series of articles that ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize. Justice Thomas has faced quite a lot of questions and backlash, but Justice Alito as well. How do you begin on even conceiving a story like that and wanting to go in that direction? And did you know that there was something there that was a story worth telling?
The task that we broadly had was to cover the judiciary. This was early in the year. Last year, we didn't know exactly what that was going to look like. We had recalled that Justice Scalia had died on a private hunting trip. And there were questions around that did not have satisfying answers. Chief among them is, what was he doing there on that trip? Is that normal? Do justices typically go on those trips? Who paid for it? These were some of the just basic questions we wanted to answer. And the task at the time was, how do you go about answering that when the institution you want to report on, in this case the federal judiciary, is carved out of the Freedom of Information Act. You cannot file public records requests to the Supreme Court. So how do you go about answering questions like that? And we started thinking about side doors, possible side doors where we can address that. One that we thought of was the marshals. The marshals provide security to the justices, so we could send in records requests for their travel records if they were detailed to the justices. We found in several reams of heavily redacted documents, there was one trip to New Haven with a justice on it. We didn't know much about it. We only knew that the flight was between Washington and New Haven, which is an easy Amtrak ride, and it was only a few hours long in New Haven. Raised a lot of questions. Who would do that? Why would they do that? Who was the justice? What were they doing in New Haven?
And it was a private flight.
This was a private flight. We didn't know who owned the jet. We didn't know anything about it. From a Facebook enthusiast page for private jet travel in New Haven, we found that on the date of the trip, someone had taken a picture and said it was great to welcome Justice Thomas to New Haven today. That, coupled with the tail number on the plane, we were able to identify Harlan Crow as the person who had paid for that trip. We didn't know anything else. We just knew about this one trip and this one justice, and it set us on down this path of trying to identify other trips that he may have received or that any justices may have received. And from there, we received a lot of tips after we started publishing the original stories. We later learned what the purpose of that trip to New Haven was. It was to unveil a painting of Justice Thomas at the law school at Yale. He went there to look at it and then just go back. We learned about Justice Alito from similar types of tips, and the way we reported them was, as you were saying earlier, Katelyn, was all shoe leather. This was not the type of story where we could go talk to people really in the legal community about this. They weren't in the positions to know. People like clerks who you might think would be helpful. It ended up being service workers. We fanned out across the country, I think 15 states, ultimately, the team and I, to knock on doors of waitresses, limousine drivers, private jet pilots, bartenders, chauffeurs, scuba diver instructors, painters, anyone who may have interfaced with these billionaires and their friends who were the justices.
And how many no's did you get, or doors closed in your face?
I would say, for every 100 doors I knocked on, I think 10 people would agree to chat with me on the porch for a minute. Maybe one of those 10 would invite me in for coffee. So it was a very, very high rejection rate. A lot of self-reflecting in the car about what I could have said differently. But that's how we did. That's how we reported this story. And what we were looking for was not just witness accounts. We were looking for documentation, contemporaneous documentation of what the justice had received, when, all those types of questions. And we were lucky enough to find instances where maybe there were pictures taken of the trip. Maybe there was one case in New Zealand where Justice Thomas left an autographed book for one of the yacht workers. That's a very helpful piece of evidence. And things like that really became the bedrock of these stories.
So did someone fly to New Zealand?
No, that person was stateside. There was frustratingly little travel to exotic locations for this.
Reporters are always trying to find ways to have their editors send them to Cyprus or the Bahamas.
No, this was not one of those. No, we were in the middle of the country, talking with regular people, and these are not media savvy people. So we spent a good amount of our time just explaining what it is we were doing and why it mattered, and to invite people to help us out. And we found that there were a lot of people who were, before we had even contacted them, a little incensed about what had happened, about this seemingly double standard for Supreme Court justices opposed to, say, local city councilmen. I was saying earlier, I started my career in a small paper in Florida, the Naples Daily News, and city councilmen there would not be able to accept such gifts, and they were held to a higher standard in many ways than the justices were. And I think that upset and scandalized a lot of people, and I think that's why they're willing to help us.
So what was the amount of time that lapsed between the beginning question of, we have questions about Justice Scalia on the hunting trip to the first date of publication? And at what point did you have to say to your editors, can you guys fund us flying around the country and taking weeks and weeks knocking on doors?
The thing about ProPublica, which is why I love the place so much, is that it has resources devoted specifically for this. ProPublica, our model is investigations. It's not a luxury at ProPublica like it is at many newspapers. It's all we do. So the budget for reporting it's not endless or anything, but it's quite liberal in what we can do just to hunt down tips. We spent a lot of time reporting stories that we never publish all the time. We probably spend more time reporting stories we don't publish than a lot of traditional newspapers do for stories they do publish. And that's a luxury we have that I don't take lightly at all. I would say it was about maybe 4 months where my colleagues, Justin, Alex, and Josh, were chasing down that original tip between that and first publication. I got involved when the additional tips about the additional billionaire benefactors came in. We got inundated with tips about the house that Crow had bought, tips about different billionaires, tips about Alito, and they realized they had sort of a surfeit of these and they needed additional help. And we spent the next 8 months of the year traveling, often on weekends at night, talking to people at their homes.
So how do you determine, and how do you do the work to determine that this isn't the norm? The judiciary is so opaque, and there are a lot of very well-connected judges that sit on the Supreme Court or elsewhere who exist in quite elite circles. Are you talking to people about that, or is it just where you're looking, well, Justice Thomas and Justice Alito did this, but we're not finding that with the other justices? How did you gauge that and make sure that you were pursuing something that was indeed abnormal?
We had 2 lodestars for the reporting. One was the Ethics in Government Act, which is a Watergate-era transparency law. Pretty much says that all government officials, when they receive things, have to disclose them. The justices and the federal judiciary itself is very broad in what judges can accept, what types of gifts they can accept. But it's pretty prescriptive on what they have to disclose, what they have to report. What we were finding were failures to disclose the things that the experts told us should have been reported. So that was a legal avenue that we used as sort of a guiding light. The second was norms, as you were saying, what's normative. All the scholars we talked to, the other judges we talked to, said there's nothing normal about this degree of largesse coming into a judge's life after they are appointed to the bench. Each one of these billionaires we found came into the justice's life after he was appointed to the bench. That, to us, raised a lot of flags, too. It raised a lot of questions about why they might do that, what's normal or what's normative. The defense from the justices, I should say, from the beginning has been, these are actual friends of mine. These are dear friends of mine. The billionaires would tell us the same thing. What's wrong with having a friend out? What's wrong with flying them around? These are dear friends of ours. And the question was always, would they be your dear friends if you were not a Supreme Court justice? This, to us, was enough. We were not bowing at the altar of the Ethics in Government Act all year. We were also trying to address what was normal or normative and what type of interests would such billionaires have before the court. Why would they want to be, currying these relationships?
Can you take just a minute and talk again about the gifts that you found had been given, so everybody has a sense of the magnitude of what we're discussing here?
Sure. I worked on one specific story about Justice Thomas, and by my undercount, it was 38 luxury travel vacations. So this is on a yacht, this is on a private jet, this is out to resorts, privately held resorts, whitewater rafting trips, skybox tickets at football games. And what we found was very common was private travel on jets from these billionaires. We, like I was saying before, we reported this by talking to the flight attendants, gathering pictures and flight data when these trips took place, talking to people on the ground who saw them, first-hand witnesses. At the same time, we were sending records requests to places like public universities athletics directors programs for any chatter about when the justice was coming in town for that football game he was attending in the skybox. And we had other things too, like, photographs of a whitewater rafting trip on Snake River in Jackson Hole. We wanted to figure out, this is just by way of illustration about what some of the reporting was, we wanted to figure out when that trip took place. Was it connected to that football game? Was it the same guy who flew him out? Was David Sokol, the former heir apparent of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's number 2, he had taken him out. He had taken him to Nebraska, and we wanted to know, was it his place up in Jackson Hole? All we had was a picture of them rafting, and the life vests we noticed were a little interesting. They had like an interesting pattern to them. So we found every dude ranch and private rafting company online marketing material that showed the pictures of the vests, narrowed it down to a couple dozen. And then I spent a few weeks calling every single one of those companies, asking them to please look through their books to see if they could confirm when this trip took place and who was on it. And astonishingly, a lot of them wanted to. They wanted to help, and they did, and I was able to narrow down exactly when that trip took place and who all was there from that.
And this was famously before your stories were publishing. Justice Thomas had this public reputation and persona as someone who did RV trips across the country and parked his RV in Walmart parking lots, that was what he was known for as far as his travel. And so this was quite a sea change. I'm kind of curious what the response was to your stories, like the immediate response. Did the Supreme Court say something? Did you hear from the justices?
Sure, yeah, I mean, the third thing I should point out was apparent hypocrisy, saying that they like to vacation like normal Americans and sleep in Walmart parking lots. That type of sentiment matters if that's not true, right? So if we could point out hypocrisy, that itself would be newsworthy. So that was another avenue we pursued. The responses, we didn't hear much after the initial stories. The defense, like I said, was always, these are actual friends. I did not believe that I had to report or disclose these trips. I believe they were covered under what's known as the personal hospitality exemption. I won't bore you with it, but they thought they didn't need to disclose these things. There was one instance in which my colleagues were writing about Justice Alito. We learned that he had taken a trip out to Alaska to go salmon fishing. Justice Scalia was there too. The trip was paid for by a hedge fund billionaire who later had business before the court. His company did. We were working on the story, and what we always do when we're reporting on anyone at ProPublica is we reach out to them well in advance and we ask for an interview. We want to hear their side. We're genuinely interested in additional perspectives and context around any story. And more than that, we practice something called no surprises journalism. We believe that nobody should ever be surprised by something they read about themselves in a story. So we reach out with the interview requests. If they don't grant it, they say no or don't respond, we send them a letter detailing everything that we're intending to report on. We ask them questions. We give them every fact, every empirical fact, every invitation to fact check what we intend to report well in advance of the story. That has been used against us in the past, and that's what happened here. Justice Alito, after the court said he wasn't going to respond, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal before we published our story, which I think his op-ed was likely incomprehensible to the entire world besides the four of us at ProPublica, because only we knew what he was talking about because we hadn't published the story yet. But it had an impact that I don't know if he was intending, but the impact was that a lot of people were very excited for the story we were working on. So it was...
And was that journalists that were saying, oh, there must be something coming here, or was it more of a general, your sources realized it was coming?
No, it was because we had sent him that letter. We had sent him the no surprises letter. We had asked for the interview, and then we sent these letters that have our questions in them have, like I was saying, pretty much everything that's going to be in the story. So he used that to write this op-ed in response to what we hadn't actually published yet, but what we were intending to publish.
What about at the end of each one of these stories, if you look at them on the ProPublica website, it says, tips, more information, send, and it lists the emails of the reporters that worked on these stories. Did this open the floodgates, or did people clam up afterwards? And especially what happened within the social groups, the people within the Federalist Society or from Yale Law School. Did those people become more willing to talk after you started publishing, or less?
Some people, especially judges. We were always interested in the opinion of judges about what was happening, if this was normal. To them, a lot of people opened up after they saw the stories. I think, like others, they felt a little offended by some of what they were reading, and they wanted to weigh in. Sources came out of the woodwork for sure to tell us about new gifts and trips we did not know about, which was great. It caught a lot of people's attention. We were always interested in the very beginning about all the justices. This one of the common responses and critiques of the journalism, it wasn't of the journalism, it was of the stories themselves, was that you are only choosing justices with which you disagree, with whom you disagree ideologically, you being ProPublica. These are conservative judges. This is liberal media just choosing people whose opinions they disagree with. And our response to that was always, no, we want to report on all the justices. If you know of a secret gift or trip that a liberally appointed justice received, please tell us. We wanted to know about that all year. The tips we did get on other justices didn't pan out, didn't turn out to be true, or they, more often than not, what they were trips or gifts that people knew about because the justices had disclosed them. That was the line we drew about secret versus non-secret. If you disclosed it, it's not as newsworthy as if you didn't. And we at ProPublica were interested in secrets. And if you, the tipster, the reader, already knows about it, it's likely you know about it because it was reported, and it was reported because that judge had disclosed it.
And then once you publish, do you feel pressure of some sort to continue the story so that more and more people are seeing it? And how are you trying to get it in front of people to see? And then, by an extension, do you hope that there is some sort of public response, either more recusals from cases? What happens once you're in that realm of you have your work done?
Yeah, ProPublica has no problem saying that our mission is to have impact, is to make change for good. If we identify a problem in the world, we hope it's addressed by the people who can address it. This was a unique story in a lot of ways because the judiciary regulates itself. This is a constitutional issue. It's come up a lot. There are bills right now to reform the court, but they're not likely to go anywhere because of this constitutional problems, the separation of powers. However, there's also supposed to be checks and balances, so a lot of scholars have been trying to think of ways to address this, what has been sort of this ethical crisis that's been roiling the court now. So, some of the solutions that were put forth are, should there be an independent body of retired judges that take questions of recusal from judges, including justices, take questions of what gifts they can receive, what they need to disclose. These are all things that have come up before. Before our reporting, there's no code of ethics that the justices themselves adhere to. Since we published the story, they put out one. Notably, there is no what we have been calling an enforcement mechanism, because like I said before, they are largely a power unto themselves. So the idea of anyone on the outside telling them what they can and can't do has always been a point of contention at the court. So it raises a lot of questions about what really can be done here. And we're seeing it kind of play out right now. It's at least made it into the public domain, I think in a lot of ways that hadn't been earlier. The story was, it was on an episode of General Hospital. They I guess, satirized it. The announcers of the Nathan's hot dog eating contest also made some jokes about it. So it's made its way into like the weird public spheres of the world that I think a story I've never worked on has done that before. So it's been great to just see all the public response to it.
And are you still doing reporting on it?
Yeah, we are. We're still fielding tips. We're still learning about new stuff. The whole team has a lot going on, but it's not an area that we're not going to be interested in for I think years to come.
So let me say, as the lawyer in this threesome, one of the things that was ingrained in me and became a part of my professional character from the time I was in law school was that you've got to avoid impropriety and you've got to avoid creating the appearance of impropriety. And how do you think people reacted to these stories in that sense? Did it leave them feeling as if maybe something wasn't right here?
I think it actually fell on partisan lines, the response. Say half the readers felt that there was an obvious appearance of impropriety. I don't know about half, but a good percentage thought that if you couldn't prove that the justice had received something and then acted in an abnormal way from the bench, it was a non-story. Even when we did the case about the Alito, Alaska trip, where the benefactor there had cases before the court, they said, well, it doesn't matter because he didn't change his position necessarily, or you didn't find proof that he changed his position because of the trip. Alito did, even though he didn't recuse himself from that case. We wrote about Chevron doctrine. Thomas had flipped his position on that after attending Koch-sponsored events. The Koch's political network were bringing the Chevron appeal to the court.
And it's largely been struck down since.
Yeah. Chevron's been repealed. So I got to a point where I don't think it mattered a whole lot. A lot of people, some of the most vocal on social media and such, believe that our stories, like I was saying earlier, were politically motivated from the beginning. And it wasn't the journalism. They couldn't find fault with the journalism, but it was the pursuit of the stories themselves that they took issue with. Others, though, I should say, were extremely grateful, and I think they had not seen this type of reporting before, and they were really happy to have seen it. The court had been covered as largely this vaunted institution where the decisions that it makes impact everyday Americans, and I think Supreme Court reporters have been doing the yeoman's work of explaining that to readers in a very important way, but it didn't leave a lot of room for them to cover the justices themselves as people. These people are appointed lifetime tenure. So we, I think, took the position that they are government officials with inordinate amount of power, so they deserve to be covered as such.
Well, it has been written that the flow of gifts began, in fact, when Justice Thomas complained about the level of compensation that was being paid to Supreme Court justices, and that the motivation was not to get him to change his positions, but instead to keep a justice with his positions on the Supreme Court rather than leaving for something more lucrative.
Yeah, one of the reporting avenues I didn't talk about was dead judges and justices' personal papers that they had archived at universities. Chief Justice Rehnquist's papers in Stanford, as well as other administrators, had given boxes to these universities that are open to the public. One of the things we did was spend days pouring through these boxes, individual letters, correspondence. One of the letters I found at the University of Utah on like my 5th day there was this letter from an administrator of the court telling Chief Justice Rehnquist that Justice Thomas had told former Senator Cliff Stearns that he was unhappy about the compensation, and justices were considering resigning. A lot of the justices, not Thomas or Scalia, came from lucrative legal careers. They were in private practice. Scalia and Thomas were not. They had very humble beginnings. So this idea started percolating where did these billionaires come from, and what were they really doing? And what we found when speaking about this with experts was that, well, these are ideologically aligned people, and it's not necessarily a single case that they might be interested in, but keeping the justices comfortable on the bench so they don't leave, because we would not like an ideologically misaligned person to take their spot.
Also, I once, in a setting where people were just sort of gabbing, overheard a justice who was no longer with us, remark that other justices were maybe writing books because it's very expensive to live in Washington. It's very expensive to keep up appearances. And that's there is a real interesting dynamic of these Supreme Court justices that are at the absolute pinnacle of ideological thought and legal thought, and yet they are not the top of the pile financially in Washington, let alone New York or other parts of the country. But those are the people that they want to associate with.
Compared to their peers who are in, the big white shoe firms or in-house counsel at companies, they make fractions of what those people do. And a lot of them do sell books. There was great reporting in the AP about Justice Sotomayor's book sales campaign around this very same issue. And they've said for years, the judges and justices, that they don't get paid commensurate with the work that they do, especially among their peers. Mm-hmm. And there's validity to that point. It's going to undermine what I just said, but I think it's maybe $340.
That's in the hundreds of thousands. If you're at a private practice law firm in Washington, D.C., and you're a appellate partner, say, you're billing at $2,000 an hour, you have an equity stake in your firm, and can make $10 million more. I mean, you can make quite a lot of money in the millions.
Relative to the peers, it's far less.
Yeah.
And despite that, Katelyn still is not going to go to law school.
Sorry, Dad.
But I do want something not to get lost, maybe two things not to get lost. One is that when I was reading your articles, it was this headline that really caught my attention. Justice Alito took luxury fishing vacation with GOP billionaire who later had cases before the court. Everything else, there seems to be a little bit of distance, but that is taking things awfully close to where it would be hard to say that he should sit and consider those cases.
Yeah, this was the case. This was this hedge fund who had been in a protracted legal battle with the Argentinian government over a sovereign debt issue. And they had been petitioning the court for years to take the case before the trip and after the trip. After the trip, the Supreme Court took the case. Alito sided in favor of the hedge funds, and it was a windfall of money as a result. And these were our questions for Justice Alito, like, is this the appearance of impropriety? And he said, he didn't know the individual who he went on the trip with was associated with the hedge fund, and even if he did, it wouldn't have been a matter for recusal anyway, because the trip didn't amount to a real gift, because the seat on the private plane would have been vacant if he didn't sit on it.
I'd also like to go back for a moment to talk about ProPublica. Your mission statement says, "We dig deep into important issues, shining a light on abuses of power and betrayals of public trust, and we stick with those issues as long as it takes to hold power to account." Now, the Pulitzer citation credits you with being a force in having the Supreme Court adopt its first code of conduct ever. But you didn't stop there. So who makes the decision that either the powers have been held to account or they haven't, and what went into the decision in this case?
I think what we try to explain best we can in the stories we pursue is not only things that happened, gifts received, trips taken, but it's why it was able to be a secret for so long, and what are the normal accountability systems already in place, and did those fail? Did regulation fail in some way? Did regulation even exist? And I worked on a story towards the end of the year in which I tried to explain this. It was the self-policing system of the judiciary itself. They have said for years that they do not need the encroachment of Congress because they are perfectly capable of regulating one another. And the story I pursued found, well, that they aren't. They don't police themselves very much at all. In fact, the bodies that exist to, have existed in several cases to help one another, conceal certain things or continue accepting certain things. And this to me was a good, and us as the team, was a good sort of capstone on what had gone on. And to answer your question about why we decided to stop, I don't think we really have. I think we, as tips come in, we're going to continue reporting them. We can't spend our whole lives on it, but if there is credible information about newsworthy stories involving the justices, we would happily, drop what we were doing for a while and pursue them. So it is one of these things with a very long tail, I think.
Yeah, and I may have misspoken because I really was asking why you didn't stop. I didn't mean to suggest that you had.
Oh, there was such a response when we first started publishing. It was so clearly a response, and the evidence that we had accumulated in those first couple stories clearly indicated that this was a tip of the iceberg situation, where what we are learning about represents only a small sample of what's probably out there, and it will be newsworthy and valuable to readers to know about additional things. So that's why we wanted to keep pursuing it.
So what are the alternatives to the code of conduct without an enforcement mechanism that have been put forward?
I think the most palatable one that I've seen, palatable to the judiciary, that I've seen was raised by Judge Fogel, Jeremy Fogel out in San Francisco, who has said that what they really need is an independent advisory board of retired judges with, unassailable ethics who can be consulted, even by the justices. It's not going to take an act of Congress. It will still largely represent, self-regulation, but given that they're retired or independent, it might be a little bit better. They can provide advice and they can answer questions whenever things like this come up, so that judges and justices don't have to rely on their own compass to make these decisions.
Well, let me turn to Katelyn for a little bit, because as I said before, she has been all over the country. You might see her Monday in Atlanta and Tuesday in New York and Wednesday in Washington and Thursday in Florida. Can you talk a little bit about the cases that you have been covering?
Yeah, so I have spent quite a lot of time over the past year covering especially the federal cases against Donald Trump, the January 6th, 2020 election case in Washington, D.C., which is still ongoing and was paused because of a significant question before the Supreme Court about immunity around the presidency. They determined that there is a level of immunity around the presidency where a former president or a current president cannot be charged with a crime when they're acting in their official capacity and working as the head of the executive branch, and that any of that, crucially, any of that work also cannot be used as evidence in a court case, which is going to have quite a lot of implications going forward that we fully haven't even grasped on how investigations can happen, how court cases could play out. So I've spent a lot of the last year focused on that and that case. The proceedings are restarting. In Florida, that was where I spent quite a lot of time covering the classified documents case against Donald Trump and two other co-defendants accused of mishandling more than 30 classified records that were kept at Mar-a-Lago, flown there in the last couple hours of the Trump presidency, kept in a room that was very insecure, in boxes that were at times knocked over inside closets, in a bathroom. Those classified records were not where they should have been. Trump has essentially admitted in many ways that they were his records and he had them there at Mar-a-Lago after the presidency. There's also an obstruction case around that was accusing him and two others of trying to hide the records when the National Archives and then subsequently the FBI and the Justice Department wanted to recover them to get them secured. The case has been dismissed. It is over as of right now because there is a judge, a very a judge who has not been on the bench very long, who is a Trump appointee named Eileen Cannon. She is the only judge sitting in a very beautiful federal courthouse in Fort Pierce, Florida, which is about an hour and a half, a little more, east of Orlando and an hour north of West Palm. The federal courthouse has had several proceedings over this case. She was greenlighting various things, but not really getting into the meat of the case to look at it to get to trial. She was reviewing classified records with the parties and then dismissed it to say that she believed under the law that the special counsel's office, the prosecutor office that brought that case, Jack Smith, against Donald Trump and the two co-defendants, that he was operating outside of the parameters of the Constitution because he was not receiving specific congressional appropriation for his office, and that he was not properly appointed and approved by the Senate, that the Justice Department, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, put him in place. She did that after Justice Thomas had written a concurrence in the presidential immunity decision at the end of this term on July 1st, not grappling with the idea of presidential immunity in the other Trump case, but instead, Justice Thomas wrote a concurrence about how he didn't believe the special counsel's office was legal. And so Judge Cannon essentially co-opted that decision in many ways, referred to it in her opinion, and dismissed the case. It's now on appeal. That issue is very likely to go to the Supreme Court, so I'm following that as it moves through the court system. But there are a lot of interesting stories and important stories to be telling right now about not just how these legal ideas come into play and how they find their way into district court opinions, and we don't know yet if others on the Supreme Court will agree with Justice Thomas when that issue gets before the Supreme Court. It's possible they want to take that issue. They might not. But it also is a situation that's quite similar to what Brett was saying earlier about looking at judges as people in social networks. And Judge Cannon is a judge on the federal bench with a lifetime appointment in Florida, the Southern District of Florida, who was very not well known and was on a trajectory in her career to potentially never have a newsworthy, let alone significant case like this that would work its way through the system. And once the Trump case was randomly assigned to her, which it was randomly assigned to her in Florida last year, just in July, she was placed in a situation where she had to manage this and had many, many hearings to grapple with it, and was even told, according to the New York Times, by two different judges in the same district, or called and asked, you actually want this case, you're a new judge, and was struck down on some early things she did related to the Trump probe when she said she was going to pause things. And so it's possible that she is putting a valid argument out there with her opinion and that could be upheld. But it's also possible that it would be an absolute outlier for the rest of the judiciary and could still be an outlier depending on what the Supreme Court wants to do with the special counsel. And so we don't know what will happen with that case against Trump in Florida, but as of now, it's closed.
And I said, I guess you didn't, I said, so you can agree with me, if you've covered the Georgia case too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the Georgia case is the state case against Donald Trump, and I can't remember exactly how many defendants are left. Some have pled guilty. I think it was originally 19 defendants in Georgia related. It's accusing them of a racketeering conspiracy to influence the election in 2020, and I was there for the arrests and arraignments where every single person, including Trump, had to go to jail to be processed in the justice system. And there have been some hearings there, but that case is largely paused as well because there have been questions that have arisen about the prosecutor there. And Donald Trump's team has been quite successful, not just in this Florida case, but in that Georgia case, in New York, to raise questions in those cases, in the forum of court, to raise questions about the prosecutors and to try and say this is an illegitimate prosecutor. He's clearly been successful in Florida so far with Judge Cannon. In Georgia, there is an appeals court that's looking at the question of whether the prosecutor there was out of line in speaking publicly about the case and about the bringing the case and the prosecution. And so we will see what happens. There's a lot of ways to challenge these cases.
Well, let me make a general statement that you can then agree or disagree with, or maybe do a combination. My sense, looking at the judicial system in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election, was that the courts looked very, very good. They had important issues being brought their way. They dealt with them expeditiously, as they had to, because there was a transition of one kind or another presumably coming. There were not really well-founded allegations of political favoritism. You did have judges who, like Judge Cannon, had been appointed not much earlier by the sitting president, and yet they were not afraid to rule against him when they thought that was the law. And now to fast forward, as I did before, for 3.5 years or whatever it is, the judicial system, I think, seems to a lot of people to be kind of slow and rickety and not up to the challenges that are being brought its way.
Well, some people would say that's a feature, not a bug, with due process, that everyone should have the ability to have their case and time before the court. This argument actually came up in one of the Trump cases in Washington, D.C., where the prosecutors and the judge both were trying to move it quite fast before it got put on hold by the Supreme Court. And Trump's team kept saying, hey, it's our right. If we want a speedy trial, we can ask for it. But we're not asking for that. Let's take it slow. Let's drag it out as long as we can. And they succeeded at that. But at the same, on the converse, in 2020, the courts were being utilized by the people wanting to spread disinformation about the election, put the idea of fraud into the system, because they would file affidavits that they had not checked out. There are lawyers that have faced professional discipline for this. Some have been disbarred. Rudy Giuliani has been disbarred for this. John Eastman has also faced significant consequences, is on the road to disbarment in California. That people were going to court and putting the idea and spreading the idea of election fraud because of what they were putting in the court system. And it was giving it a level of credibility because it was in court being done by lawyers that it might not have had if it was just people talking in the political sphere. And judges did move quickly. We were able to cover those, interestingly, because many of them were in federal courts across the country. Federal courts don't have a lot of transparency to the proceedings. You can't listen, you can't watch on YouTube a federal court proceeding. There are no cameras in federal courts. But in that moment in 2020, because of COVID, there were phone lines that you could listen to court hearings. So there were reporters, at least at CNN, I don't know, I think a lot of news organizations I had 2 phones on some days listening to a court hearing in Arizona and one in Michigan at the same time. And those judges did say quite forceful things that we were able to cover, but it took quite a bit of time, and it did help. I do think it helped spread the idea that there could be fraud, and you saw the lawyers then coming out who had filed these things. Well, we're continuing to appeal. This issue isn't dead because it's still in the system. So we don't know if this election will result in that, but it's quite possible that there will be legal challenges that look similar, and you can already start seeing at least Donald Trump and J.D. Vance trying to put this idea into the bloodstream that the election might be not fair to them.
I think the opacity problem has not helped its credibility.
Great.
The deliberations that judges and justices make are perfectly reasonable for those to be private deliberations, but how a lot of these systems work, their accessibility to the public is largely under wraps. When I was knocking on doors, on judges' doors, I got a call from the marshals chastising me for doing that because there had been a federal judge's son, Salinas' son, who had been killed a few years ago, and they were constantly raising that specter of, the physical threat. And I said, I'm just knocking on a door, or I'm just making a phone call. This is a First Amendment right of mine. The marshals hung up the phone on me. He wouldn't give me his name. He just hung up. But I don't think it helps when there's already people who are very upset about either one of the two scandals, the ethics scandal, or not a scandal, but its problem of people disagreeing with the jurisprudence. It doesn't help when there's just not a lot of transparency into the processes that are enshrined.
Yeah, and one of the things, one of the examples of this, I think is quite apparent with the January 6th riot defendants. A lot of people will say in the political sphere that there are many, many of these people in jail for no reason, or that were peaceful. There are actually it's a very small subset of Capitol rioters who have been ordered to stay detained behind bars awaiting trial. And the reason is that largely those people that were either violent or had a criminal history, brought weapons and, attacked police officers on the grounds of the Capitol. The judges that were keeping them behind bars were very, very, many of them did not want to keep people behind bars as they were bringing them in for their detention hearings. And with these proceedings, they are opaque. Even when you go and attend a Capitol riot proceeding in court, sometimes the courtroom will be full, but a lot of times there's no one there except the parties and the judge. And there have been sentencings where in federal court, there's no way to see how that proceeding went, where the defendant will admit to their crimes and then tell the judge that they are absolutely sorry and remorseful and can't believe that they did this horrific thing on January 6th, and then walk outside of the courthouse and in front of the courthouse say something very different to cameras. That makes judges very unhappy, but there's nothing that they are going to do because they've already sentenced the person. And some of those people end up getting booked on right-wing cable news and continuing what they said outside of the courtroom, but not what they said inside the courtroom. This is a real thing that we don't get to see proceedings. And we didn't get to see any judges on camera telling the people who brought those cases in 2020, are you serious? I'm not going to side with you.
Let me change direction just for a moment. Something quite unusual happened last week when the publisher of the New York Times wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. Its title was "How the Quiet War Against Press Freedom Could Come to America." And the article relied initially and pretty heavily on the example of President Orban in Hungary. It also did talk about the president of Brazil and the government in India as people working in very important arms of the press. Is this something that worries you?
I think so. Bolsonaro and Modi, it starts as rhetoric, I think, historically. This idea that the press is dishonest and that the articles published represent some threat to the state. This has been an idea of authoritarian regimes for decades and centuries. What has made the press freedoms in America so great is that we're enshrined in the First Amendment. I think we're the only other profession besides lawyers that are actually named in the First Amendment.
Lobbyists.
Sure, yeah. I'm sorry. The things that I really appreciate about here are all those protections that we have, but in the past couple of years, I've seen some very disquieting examples of attacks on the free press by the state. I think it was earlier this year that newspaper in Kansas was raided by a sheriff's office. It's happened down south too. There'll be, sheriff's deputies who have gone around picking up copies of the newspaper and setting them on fire if there's a story coming out that they disagree with. Up in New Hampshire, there was a journalist's house and her parents' house were vandalized and bricks thrown through the window because she was reporting on stories about an elected official. So all these individual cases happening, whether it becomes a widespread issue, I don't know. But if the rhetoric is that a journalist is somehow the enemy of the people, and rather than a representative of facts and truth, I think that's a real problem to be concerned about. I don't think the problems we are facing are that much like what's happening to journalists in India or in Mexico or in Brazil, but it's certainly something we're concerned about if we're labeled as enemies.
Katelyn?
Yeah, I think a lot about the press as the fourth estate, right? So the first, second, third estates would be the first three articles of the Constitution, right? The executive branch, Congress, the judiciary, and then the press. And there's been a systematic loss of trust and also just generally public attacks on all of those institutions that enabled this democracy to function. And the more you're undercutting the press, the less people are able to tell what's true and who the organizations are to trust and who's not. And I think there's also a loss in people's ability sometimes to differentiate between fact and opinion. We see this, I think, quite a lot in the political world, where there are people who exist to give opinions and to comment and to sway you in a direction. That's a different role than the people like Brett and I who are gathering information and presenting it in storytelling and in stories. And I think Pitt is quite good at teaching the traditions of journalism in that way. But if we lose that, we will lose our ability to differentiate between what's actually important and not.
It's a pillar of a liberal democracy to have a functioning press. Like when we assess other countries' democracies, this is one of the first things we look at. And I think the traditional role of the media was to be the intermediary between the state and people. And now that communication and information has been democratized in a way across social media, that role is a little different than it used to be, especially when institutions can communicate directly with constituents, with consumers on Twitter. It changes things. It changes how we're seen. I think a lot of them would prefer us to be stenographers of the things they say rather than journalists who put what they say and do into context. That's what they take umbrage with, but it's our job to keep doing it. So there's always going to be a conflict with that. That conflict is healthy, I think, for democracy.
I think we have people with microphones. Am I right? I don't see anyone. Okay. So why don't we take a couple of questions from the audience, if there are any. Okay, we've got two questions on this side, Kim. And we've got Diane making her way. Well, Kim, come on and give him a microphone.
Is it on?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, you know, what we ought to do is get the sound turned up. We're talking as loud as we can.
Am I being heard?
Yes.
Good. As I listened, two thoughts occurred to me, and I think they're very relevant. One is we get more and more appointments to the Supreme Court who have not come up through the leavening process of a lower court and exposure to the ethical codes and the experience of having to deal with the stresses. They come in too close to the top, and that creates a problem. And for them, just in knowing what the ethics are. The other is related. As the people are being drawn in, they're comparing themselves at the top of the court to the people who are top in the other organizations, such as law firms, who do a very nice job, I believe, Mark. And therefore, they expect that they should be able to earn at a rate comparable to that. Recently, I think it was in the Washington Post, they observed that the only way a Supreme Court justice could make extra money was to write a memoir.
Is there a question on that?
Okay, we've got a question or a comment.
Yeah, I actually have two questions.
Kim?
And the
Why don't you get
first,
'em? Go ahead. Ron, raise your hand. Let's get the microphones going.
so the first question is, you know, for years now, Donald Trump has been saying that all his legal woes are the result of President Biden weaponizing the justice system against us. And I would ask, is there any grain of truth at all about that? I suspect there isn't. The second question is, as journalists, we talked a little bit about different outlets, and I would be curious to know, as far as television broadcasting goes, for daily news, which outlets do you consider to be the most unbiased and or realistic?
Well, I'm going to say CNN because and there are reporters. We put a lot of effort into reporting facts and making sure we understand the full context. I read every single court filing in every single case against Donald Trump so that I'm able to be informed on that. Regarding the weaponization of the Justice Department, that is a frequent attack. There have been, first of all, the state cases are separate. There's just no validity to that. There is one prosecutor on the New York case against Donald Trump where there was a conviction secured that had worked at the Justice Department previously, but that is not the Biden administration weaponizing the Justice Department. That case is separate. And also remember, each of these cases, it is not just prosecutors bringing these cases. These cases go through grand jury review, which is nearly 24 people looking at the evidence to determine whether there's probable cause to approve an indictment. They have to vote. And it has to go through those people. It has to go through judges before it gets to trial. The warrants, search warrants and seizure warrants in Florida of Mar-a-Lago were reviewed by appointees to the federal bench, a magistrate judge in Florida, to say, yes, that is a separate branch of government from the Biden administration, the executive branch. And then on top of that, there is obviously quite a bit of a debate over special counsel's offices right now and whether they're valid. But the reason that they are being appointed is so that there's even an additional barrier between the White House, which is Joe Biden, the president, and the prosecutors who are bringing those cases. The Attorney General is setting up special counsel's offices, and there's mechanisms there that are regulated to give distance there. And those decisions, as far as I'm aware, are being made by those offices, and there is quite a divide. So, and also, you know, you can look and see the president's son, Hunter Biden, has been successfully prosecuted twice now in federal court in Delaware and pled guilty in California from a Justice Department investigation.
The second question, too, the local journalism, I think, is very important, much more in a lot of ways than national press. So if you're looking for outlets that you can trust, I'd like to think it's the local papers. Here's the PG. No matter where you are, I think they do the yeoman's work of being fair to the best of their ability. The charges of biases are historical and they're not going anywhere. The people who make up news organizations are human with inherent biases. So for us to act as if we don't have them, I think is a little misleading. And I think the theater of objectivity is a little harmful. The best we can do is to be fair. I think that's our charge, is to be as fair as we can. We'll always be accused of bias for the stories we select. Selection bias is what we do every day when we choose what to report and what not to report. So that won't change. And I would recommend supporting your local news outlets if you can.
Fully endorse that.
The local news outlets are, there was a traffic jam or a truck burst into flames. It's not what it was.
Okay, let me try to get some more questions in. We'll go to Professor Brand, then we'll go to the front row. Then there was somebody in the row right behind you, Ron, who had a question.
Yeah, the program began with discussion of declining approval in the judiciary. And just before the questions, it came to safety of members of the press, which led to comments about declining trust of the press. And one could, if they listened to enough outlets, surmise that one part of the press is actively seeking to create distrust of other parts of the press. And the press is not a uniform body. And how do you deal with that in your work?
I've always found a lot of the people I approach for stories are told to be distrustful of the mainstream media. And they think of the mainstream media as a monolith, as you were saying, uniform. When I go to a house and someone is all of a sudden interfacing with a reporter for the first time, I think a lot of that myth sort of fades away when we explain what it is we're doing, why we think it's important. You could not want to participate in the story. You could not want to talk to me. I've covered Trump rallies where I go up to people, and all of a sudden a lot of the illusions they had about the press sort of go away because they're talking to another person who's being very polite, explaining what it is they want to do. That's why I think, again, going back to my soapbox about local media, that's why I think it's so important, because they're the ones who are most likely to be interacting with members of their community who are then forming opinions about the press. I think when a lot of things get flattened in the national news or simplified, that's when people start drawing these conclusions, and there's a lot of outlets these days who monetize outrage about them, the press. They want you to believe this, but I'm going to tell you this real truth here. And that's why I think a lot of this narrative has seeped throughout.
But also, I would just add, sometimes people aren't polite, but that doesn't mean that I would stop wanting to talk to them. Just like anyone else, that's part of our job, to talk to people on all of the sides.
Sir.
Hi, I guess I have a couple of more smaller scale questions. So the first is, I guess, how long did you both work for the Pitt News?
Yeah.
And the second one, I guess, is do you have any opinions on the long form video sector of journalism?
All 3 years that I was at Pitt.
Same, all 3 years. I was sent there because I was less interested. I was interested in something that was not just going to class, and I want to spend all my time. And an advisor in the Honors College said, well, nobody ever leaves the newspaper. They sleep there. Oh, that sounds really fun. So 3 years.
You'd probably be better on the second question. What was the, can you
Yeah,
say
what
the
was
second
that
question again?
Long
Do you have any
form
opinion?
video.
Oh, long-form video.
Yeah, long form video. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually to the question about how to talk to people that are quite angry or don't trust the press. I think some of, to credit CNN only, but I think there is really powerful long-form video in what we would call like a documentary style, hour-long programs that's work being done by a guy named Donny O'Sullivan, who's Irish, and goes to right-wing rallies often, and people will swear at him, and he'll say, "So you said you're from Ohio?" But he does get more and more out of people the longer he talks to them, because it is what Brett's saying. We are people once you're in conversation. And I do think that there is really powerful long-form video. You just have to be able to hold someone's attention. It's hard.
Yeah, we produce documentaries alongside of our long articles a lot, so there is an audience for it, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question.
I have two questions. So the first is a little bit sensitive, so I understand if you don't want to answer. But you mentioned there was like a reporter who had her house vandalized and like bricks thrown through her windows because she was reporting on like a certain official. So I was wondering if, given this sort of work that you guys do, like for example, like digging up dirt on Supreme Court justices or covering like a figure as controversial as Donald Trump and his court cases, if you guys ever fear for your own personal safety, and if so, how you guys handle that and cope with that. And then tangentially, I was also just intrigued by the no surprise journalism that you said ProPublica practices. That's a practice I haven't heard of before. I don't think it's a very common practice. And if there's time, I was wondering if you could speak to how and why ProPublica chose to adopt that policy.
Sure. On the first thing, not really. I've reported overseas. In Afghanistan, I had some personal safety concerns, but most of what I receive is just like online vitriol, which I often don't take super seriously. However, there are other journalists, specifically more women, I think, and journalists of color receive much harsher threats than I do. Newspapers and outlets are getting better about how to handle these and protect their journalists. Having good social media hygiene, I think, is a very important thing to limit, how much people who don't like you can find out about you, I think is important. We think the no surprises practice is our foundation of fairness. We have to be fair to the people we're reporting on, and there's nothing more unfair than not having an opportunity to address what it is this news outlet is about to write about you. If there's an allegation or something negative that is going to be reported about you in the news, how could you call yourself a fair journalist if you didn't bend over backwards for their side of the story? You may not, there's countless times where I thought I understood something. I thought it was a black and white issue. This person had done X, that's bad, we're going to do it. I go and talk to that person, they have a whole different perspective on what had happened. They have evidence that shows it's not actually what I thought that even happened. And like, here's their side of the story, and I haven't pursued that story. And
Or they provide you with a different story.
Yeah. Like, could you imagine if I didn't do that? If I didn't go seek that person's perspective, and then I just ran with the story that was wrong by omission. It's a way to be incorrect. By not giving the other side an opportunity, you can be incorrect because you've omitted their entire perspective.
I would say this isn't just a ProPublica. I mean, ProPublica is quite public about their policy, but a good reporter will contact every single person who is named in their story, period. I call everybody. At least I try to. And sometimes my story goes up and the email goes out to the person right at the same time because it's breaking news, but you're always trying to talk to people. That's just core to it. On your other point was, the safety. I also don't really fear, especially in having colleagues around the world that are in war zones. There have been circumstances where I will come out of the courthouse, say at a court appearance for Donald Trump, and there's a large crowd there of either his supporters or protesters or whatever, and it can be unsettling to come out of a very set location and run into a wall of people who's screaming to get in front of a camera, which can tend to attract attention. There once was a live shot I did where a guy in a Donald Trump mask and a jail suit stood behind me and screamed the entire time. And I was not going to let him talk over me. I was going to talk to the camera. And it was on, I think it was on Aaron Burnett's show. And the thing that you have to realize, too, in those circumstances is that news organizations are expensive. It's expensive to have people like Brett go around the country. People engage, and there are ad sales, there's donations, there's ways to fund news. Security is expensive, but we do have it. And you might see someone on television, there's often a whole crew of people, including security guards, around, and they'll tell you if you gotta go, if the temperature has changed.
I can tell from the look on her mother's face that Mrs. Polantz wished that last question hadn't been asked.
That I was told
Okay.
that we have security teams that go into war zones several times a year. We have 6 SUVs of people. We have a RV for personal needs, and we are perfectly safe all the time.
Let me remind all of you that Pitt Votes is supposed to be outside. Second, that we will be back in this same location on October the 8th for a program that is entitled NATO at 75 and the role of alliances in U.S. foreign policy. Our special guest that day will be a senior non-political appointee from the State Department, Jeff Kovar, and Professor Brandt, who is the founding director of the Center for International Legal Education here. Thank you all for coming, and let's thank Brett and Katelyn.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.